everyone to this online book event with Dr. Hilary Cottam, the author of the book *Radical which was first published in 2018. The book became very popular and it's been translated into many languages. We're here in Seoul to celebrate the publication of the book, the Korean translation of the book. And here you can see the book, right? Yeah. It's published by 협동조합 착한책가게. I'm one of the co-translators, 이태인. I go by Tae. The other translator, 박경현 소장님, is here, along with the Korean publishers. And I know this is the first time for you to visit Korea virtually or physically. Did you want to say hi to our readers?
Yes. So first of all, it's such an honor to be with you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm long fascinated by South Korea and by the story of development and the different ideas of welfare that you have. So it's a real honor to be in Seoul this morning or this evening for you. And I hope one day that I actually make it in person, but it's wonderful to be with you. And I still haven't received the book. I know that there have been postage problems in the pandemic, but I'm looking forward to receiving the book. And it's just such a pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you. And please call me Hilary. Please just call me Hilary.
Okay. We are honored to have you here with us. And we have some readers here. In fact, some of them are one of the first ones who introduced the book to Korea. And they are the leaders of social welfare policies in Korea, in the field and in the academia. So thank you for joining us. The book has received a lot of attention here. As a piece of evidence, you can see on your screen, maybe it's coming up. You can see on your screen pretty soon that one of the major Korean daily newspaper, 한겨레 신문, reported about the book and about your work. And this is not the only media coverage we had so far, and hopefully we'll have more. Now we're just going to go ahead and talk about the main themes of the book with Dr. Cottam, Hilary, and there will be a Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, I will go ahead and ask you this. We found ourselves strongly agreeing to your assessment of the problems in the welfare system. And I'm taking the liberty of speaking for all of us. You did such a wonderful job describing these problems in the first part of the book. I'm afraid that the problems are pretty relevant here in Korea as well. Tell us how you became so keen on the problems, and maybe answering it will lead you to talk about why you wrote the book.
Well, most of my work, for anybody who's read the book, really is working in communities, the communities that we call in Britain left behind communities, but I've also worked a lot across Europe, in Latin America and in Africa, building through practice different forms of support that can help people. And I wrote the book because through my work, I've really got to a stage of thinking that it's impossible really to just keep tinkering with the systems that we have and just hoping that a little improvement here and a little improvement there, which takes a lot of investment and a lot of energy, will actually make a difference. And that just as coming out of the Second World War period, across globally, we had a reimagination of what we need to support citizens to flourish. We need to have the same big imagination today. And I think in Britain, I don't know how this works in Korea at all. I mean, I'm going to learn so much from you today, which is just wonderful. But in Britain, we have this very, very frozen debate. So on the left, we have this idea that if only you gave the state huge amounts of money, somehow all the problems would be fixed. And on the right, you have the ideas, if only the state would step back and the market intervened and people were just left to stand alone on their own feet, somehow everything would be okay. And it seems to me so obvious that neither of those positions are right, because it's not just about whether we fund or don't fund what we've got. It's about how we imagine that every person can flourish now in this very different century. And because originally I studied history, and I'm very interested in Beveridge, who was the founder of the British welfare state, but whose ideas, because of course we're a colonial nation, so these ideas were kind of, exported all around the world. what really mattered about the first Beveridge report, that was the blueprint of the welfare state, was that it told this very big story about what we can dream about and how we can imagine something different. And that story was baggy in a way, like it had room for everybody to kind of reinterpret and tell their own stories. And I thought we can only make change if, again, we have this very big public debate about what does it mean to live well in the 21st century, and what are the kinds of support that we really need now. And so for me, it's been, you know, incredible that this book has had resonance across Britain and in different parts of the world, because I think often our politicians are kind of many steps behind. But when I go to book festivals, which is just members of the general public, thousands of people come, thousands of people still write to me every week, because we as citizens, we know that something profound needs to shift. And I think telling a story, a dream about what that could be, is like the first stage of really making big systemic change.
So to address the issues that you talked about in the first part of the book, and to help people to flourish their lives, to be more flourishing, you did some experiments and you discussed 5 of them in the second part of the book. And these 5 fascinating experiments are: one with families, one with adolescents, one with people looking for work, one with those with chronic health problems, and finally one with the elderly. And I just listed them using the same order that these experiments are introduced in the book. Knowing that you were involved in many more projects, I wondered why you chose these particular experiments to talk about them in the book. And I was also curious about why you arranged these in this order.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So, I mean, when the welfare states were designed, there was this idea that we would be taken care of cradle to grave. So from the moment we're born to the moment we die, there would be a way to live well. And actually, you know, when our welfare states were designed, they weren't about services, they were about this vision of living well. So I wanted to write the book in this way of what happens from the moment we're born to the moment we die, and how we think about a good life. So I structured the 5 chapters in this way. But actually the work I did wasn't organized like that at all. So the first project that I did was on aging, because I mean, some of you here today, you are practitioners, you're also in the welfare system. And because I wanted to kind of make big change, I had to think about, when I started actually working in practice, where would be the point that has least resistance. So work, I felt like with the work, which is one of the middle experiments, you can't say that you're redesigning the welfare state unless you have an answer to what is good work in this century. However, in Britain, working on work is almost impossible. The ministry has all the data, they think they've got all the answers, even though the statistics are terrible, and you know, we have very low paid work and many people out of work and so on, but they have the idea that they know what they're doing. In aging, however, we have an idea that nobody knows what we're doing, that, you know, we have a huge demographic shift, that we know that more and more people are growing older, living longer. We know that particularly frail population groups, 80 and above, are living longer. And so we have this big discussion in the UK about how much this is going to cost and how we don't have any systems that could help us live well. So in that sense, if you want to actually work practically and create, you know, take investment and create new services and new systems of support, aging is a really, not easy, but it's an easier place to because there's a lot of public support for the idea that we need to invent something else. So that's why I started my work in communities, just living alongside people who are 60 and above, and thinking about what mechanisms of support could we knit into people's everyday lives. But also, Tai, since you're asking about the 5 experiments, I think what's important to me about the 5 is partly that they go from birth to death, but also that some of my experiments are inside the system, as I call it, like I call it inside the belly of the beast, and some are outside the system. So the circles of support that we created to support older people are outside the formal system of welfare. So we created cooperative systems, really, that offered almost a free phone line that you can call if you want practical support, if you need somebody to come and help you in the house, if you need somebody to collect you when you're leaving hospital. And also it has a rich social calendar, so people could meet one another. We have huge problems with loneliness, and people could make friendships in natural ways. And although the first investment to start each one of these circles came from local government in Britain, so they could have it as part of their system, it was a community response with the idea that can we keep people outside of formal health and care systems as long as possible, because everybody wants to live in their own home, in their community, and live this rich life as long as they can. But with the family work, the beginning experiment, that's an example of an experiment I did that is inside the system. So in that case, I'm working with families that face multiple disadvantage. And as I document in the book, they have 30, 40, 50 professional workers in their lives. They have, health workers, they have police, they have social workers, they have debt, they have, drug problems, they have every social problem you can imagine. And so they're, on state registers at people who are at risk, their children are at risk and they're at risk. And so what I wanted to see there was, could I work with formal state systems, and could we redesign the role of health, police, the social workers and so on to provide different support? So that project, the family work, which I call the LIFE programme, is we ask the families, we work with the families and we ask them to design a system that is a way out. So we ask them, what do you need to lead a flourishing life? You decide what's the best thing for you. And so this isn't just about saying, once you've decided, we'll signpost you to an existing system. It's asking the existing system to stand beside, and this is obviously core to the work that I do. So it's redesigning the roles of the social workers and the health workers and so on, to be able to accompany families as they go on a journey of development, which has been proven to be much more successful than constantly intervening and telling families what to do, which is the work that we do now. So I suppose the book is important not just because of that arc from birth to death, but because we have these experiments that are asking paid state professionals to work really differently in new systems, and then new things begin to happen. And then on the other hand, we have examples of setting up cooperative groups within the community that also allow very different things to happen.
It's very interesting that that the 5 experiments really parallels to Beveridge's birth to death, from birth to cradle to grave, right? That's the expression. And I have to say that it was really, really refreshing. Your approach was really refreshing, because we're so used to dissecting families' needs and problems and then just connect them to whatever services and programs that are out there. And that's why they have like 70 plus workers helping professionals connected to one family without making any changes. So yeah, your approach was very, very refreshing and touching to us. And you mentioned in the book that some of the experiments were very successful, and knowing that they work, it is very tempting for a lot of us to take, for instance, Wellogram or Circle to a factory for mass production and just nationally distribute them. Wouldn't it be nice and easy, right? So how do you respond to people who say, now that we know it works, we can go ahead and do the same thing everywhere? What's your take on this idea of scaling?
Yes, this is such a good question, because I write in the book that, I mean, even I fell for this, I made mistakes with this as well, because I'm sure it's the same in Korea. Everywhere governments have this idea of like, oh, well, this is a good idea. It's only successful if we can scale it. If literally, as you say, we can put it on a factory production line and we can start to roll it out to everybody. And we can see everywhere that doesn't work, whether it's an idea grown in Korea that is then copied, or whether it's like when you see something from a different country. And we have, in Britain, we import ideas every month from the US or from New Zealand. They might have brilliant data, but they always fail in a different social context, which is the UK. So what I think is really important is this idea of a design code, of an idea of a social code where principles inside the work are really important. But then the work itself has to be reinterpreted according to different cultures, according to different places. And I don't just mean this nationally in Korea. I mean, in different, maybe in a rural region, we'll need a very different response to an inner city Seoul district will be a different response. So I think one thing we might come on to is the idea that I have this fundamental shift in my work from trying to meet people's needs to kind of thinking about what sort of systems grow capability. And I think that that's really important. But I think the most the most important thing is to really abandon this idea of scale. And I also try to think about different metaphors, you know, how we can grow different things, how we can take seeds and plant those seeds. But when we plant them in our soil with our conditions, something different starts to grow. So I think we can still learn, which is, you know, one of the reasons I'd love to come to Seoul, is I know that you have got a lot of innovation and I'd love to see it and learn from it. But then take that kind of idea and think about how it would work in a very different social context, which would be the UK social context. So I think this idea of scale is an idea of mass production, of an industrial revolution which we've left behind. I mean, especially in South Korea has left this behind, you know, that you are kind of at the forefront of a digital revolution, and that means that we can have different ideas of how we grow networks, how we grow small things that are connected together, so that we have this idea of connection and a shared vision, but then each part looks very different and very individual.
Thank you. The phrase that comes to my mind is one size doesn't fit all, right?
One size fits no one is what I would say.
Fits no one, yes, fits no one. One of the distinct features of the 21st century radical help is your emphasis on relationships. We come across with this term and its synonyms very often in your book. Tell us why relationship is important.
So I think this is a huge question, but and again, like I'm really, in the chat we can discuss whether this really does have a kind of translation to the Korean experience. But one of the things about when the welfare state was designed was that there was this idea in policymakers' lives that people live stable lives, and every now and again something might go wrong, you might become unwell, you might lose your job, and then something could be offered by the state and you could be patched up, fixed up with a band-aid, and you could carry on your life. And I think something that's in many countries, and in the UK, is that in the 21st century, this isn't a normal way of life. A normal way of life goes like this. We're constantly facing challenges, whether it's a challenge with one of our teenagers that has trouble. We have to change work a lot more than we used to. We have, you already referred to it, we have chronic conditions, which mean that often we're kind of unwell for a long period of time. We don't just have an infection and then get better from it. So this idea that we could just kind of meet people's needs and give them a pill, as it were, and say, you know, now get better, the state has given you something to meet your need, really doesn't understand what we need to live well. And so in Radical Help, I have this fundamental shift from this idea of needs, of trying to patch people up once they're broken, to thinking about what are the capabilities we need to flourish, and thinking about our lives much more as along a developmental path, that we're always growing, we always have the chance to develop, you know, in our 60s, 70s, 80s, as well as, you know, when we're 5 or 10 or whatever. And the capability framework is developed by the Nobel-winning economist Amartya Sen and the philosopher Martha Nussbaum. And at the heart of the capability approach is this question, which is, what do I really need to flourish? And what can I be? And what can I do? And it's such a simple question, but this simple question means that we have to ask, what can I be? What can I do? Is partly like, do I live in a place where there's good work? Do I live in a place where there's access to nature, where my children can play? But also, what have I been told that I can be or do? Like, have I grown up in a neighborhood where from a very young age, I've taken on the idea that actually I'm never going to be a leader, nothing great is ever going to happen to me? So what I really love about the capability approach is that we work on the real concrete things. Is there good work? Are there good schools? But we also work on the inside, like, what is society telling me, and how can I work with these ideas of what I can be? So it really begins to question power, and like, who is in power, who is deciding what I can have. And then in the work, I choose 4 capabilities. So if you read the work of Martha Nussbaum, she has about 120 capabilities, one of which is, you know, being able to play classical piano. Well, I'm sure it's lovely. In fact, I've taken up the piano, but not everybody has the possibility of learning classical piano. And one thing I do want to be able to do in my work, because it's very practical and I want to make actual change in communities, is I need to keep it quite tight so that we can understand it. And so I chose 4 capabilities that I think a good life in the 21st century, which is, we need to be able to work and learn. And when I mean learn, I don't just mean get good exam grades in a factory school like we have here in the UK. I mean really, really have the capacity to keep growing and learning through our lives. We need good health, mental and physical. We need to feel that we're a valued part of our communities. And then we need relationships with one another. And with the capability approach, I also had a different system of measures, which goes to scaling. Like we need to kind of look at different things if we're going to grow the work. And what I learned over time through the work, I mean, it should be obvious really, but I only learned it through the work, is that relationships are the most important of the four. And they're like the foundational work. And I don't know, in Britain, we have this game called Jenga, where you build big blocks. And then do you have this game in Korea? And you take out a block until it falls over. And so for me, this is like relationships are the block you can't take out. Like you can take out almost anything from somebody's life. But if you take out the relationships that we have with one another, with our communities, then our lives begin to fall apart. And actually what we see is that in conditions of big economic stress or social stress, our relationships do fall apart, which makes it much harder to parent, much harder to kind of do well at work. So if we really think about relationships, we're thinking about in every aspect of what we design, how do we ensure that people can know one another? So I say, for example, like, this means how do we design park benches? Are they places that are comfortable to sit and people mix with each other? Right down to how are schools organized. And it also means that those of us who are public professionals like me working in the public systems have to think relationally as well. So like, how do we, if we're a doctor or a nurse, how do we meet that person that comes towards us? Do we meet them in a kind of open relational way? Are our systems organized so that it's possible? I mean, in the UK, it's not possible because immediately we have to, you know, if I'm a doctor and you come and see me, immediately I need to look at my computer, I need to kind of fill in all the data. And then finally I get to actually look you in the eye and I say, you know, how are you? By which time it's too late. You know, you feel alienated. It's time for you to leave the room. There's no possibility of relationships. And then the final thing, I'm talking a lot about this, but as you say, it's so critical. The final thing to say is that if we need to make change in our lives, it's always going to be difficult. All of us know that. If maybe we want to eat less or exercise more, it's like hard to make the change and it's really hard to keep going. And what we know is that if we have a relationship, if we have somebody to support us, it's much easier to keep that going. So if we think about social change, when the relationship of trust is there, first of all, we'll talk about the things that are difficult, perhaps shameful. And then once we start to make changes, we'll carry on making those changes if we have somebody, a trusted relationship alongside us.
Thank you. So this question that you raised, what do we need to flourish? What does somebody need to flourish? It sounds like such a simple question, but I think we as a society forgot to ask this question because we caged ourselves in this mindset, which is risk management. Manage the risk instead of looking at somebody growing and flourishing. We just forgot to do that. So that was really impressive. From now on,
I think that's so important because as you manage risk, more and more money goes into that risk management, and actually it's very expensive. And then you have less and less money for any kind of development, and you're looking and looking and looking for more risk rather than development. And also the risk framework fits in a very narrow economic framework, because I think all of our societies have thought very narrowly about economics. Like, first of all, what does the welfare state cost? But also the idea that if we just earn our living, we're okay. But we're human beings. Of course, we need to earn a good living, but to flourish, we need so much more than that. And that's also very, very important, I think. Sorry, but anyway, just to interrupt.
No, it's okay. No, thank you. So from now on, our first translator, 박경현 소장님, is going to take over.
Can I just ask you, can you say your name slowly so I can learn your name?
My name is Kyung-hyun.
Kong-hyun.
Okay, very good, very good. Kyung-hyun. It's very nice to meet you, Dr. Hilary. It was a big pleasure to find your book, and I'm very happy to translate with Dr. Lee. I was a middle school teacher and later a social worker, mainly working with the school system and the community. And now I'm Chief Director of Education and Society. Recently, I'm interested in time bank and strength approach, asset-based community development, relation-centered intervention, and so on. So your suggestions meant a lot to me. So I was so glad to find your book. In your book, you talked about the use of technology in the design process. We in Korea have smartphone apps that social service users, volunteers, and social workers can use together. can they be a kind of your idea? In this time of the fourth industrial revolution, how do you suggest that we collaborate with technical engineers, software developers, and others? Is there anything important to note about the collaboration between human service and technology? What is your idea?
Yes, yes. Well, this is really a rich theme. Yes. So so first of all, I think the framing of your question is so important in terms of the fourth industrial revolution. I actually say that we're on the fifth revolution because I draw on the work of Carlota Perez. But what's really profoundly important is that our welfare systems are located in the previous industrial revolution, and that we need to understand that. So, I mean, one of the things is that our welfare system started with support for people who were out of work, because we had this huge dislocation in the economy between people who were trained for kind of an agrarian revolution, and then when the mass production revolution came along. And in fact, William Beveridge was really important because there was this perception in Britain before the welfare state that people were unemployed because there was too much migration from the rural areas to the cities. And he was the one that said, no, this is not why we have unemployment. We have unemployment because we're having this huge industrial technological shift and people aren't trained. So we need to rethink our education systems. We need to rethink support for work. So when we think about our welfare states located in the last industrial revolution, it becomes really obvious that of course we have to fundamentally redesign now, because if we're in a digital revolution, not only practically do we need completely different skills in order to work, we need completely different forms of support because we're likely to change jobs more often and so on, but also we have this huge potential resource, technology, that we could use to think about how we structure our services. So I think it's this, and you know, technology is making a lot of money. Of course, the money is not well, it's not well spread, but it means that there is actual resource in order to invest in new forms of welfare. So I think so the first thing is we need a kind of greater understanding that, you know, we have these, and it goes to Ty's point about scaling, is that we have this mindset which is still mass production, and now we need a digital mindset. But then I think the problem comes because it's very double-edged. So I would say that the work that I describe in Radical Help could not have been designed before the digital revolution. So one of the things that we see, for example, with, if I go to Circle, the fifth experiment with older people, is that at the moment, the services that we have for older people, all the money is in fixed things like places to meet, minibuses, like really fixed capital costs. And what we said is, if we have a digital platform, we just actually use Salesforce for free, and we modified it. It was always a bit clunky, but we could use it for free and we didn't have much money. Then we can get rid of all these fixed costs. So we don't need minibuses, we don't need places to meet, because what we'll put on our platform is, oh, this person can offer a lift. This is towards the time banking idea you were talking about. This person can lend us their house, this community has a village hall, whatever it is. We had all of this for free on the platform. So we were able to use technology to completely invert the business case and begin to think in a completely different way about where we put money. And also, I mean, just this is a very small point, but I'm interested in time banking, but one of the lessons in the UK about time banking is that only middle class people are interested, that really it never goes to lower socioeconomic groups. So one of the things we did with our circle is we said, you can put time on the platform or you can put money. So again, we can use a digital platform to mix everything up together, whereas before it used to be, well, this money is from the state and this time is this person's, but now we can mix it all up. The problem comes, however, and I'm sure you've seen this in your work because it's you know, you are a social worker and you work in the school system, is that has to be the starting point. And unfortunately, what we see a lot of is we see technical people, digital people going around saying, I've got this app, it could do this for you. So the start always is with the technology, like how could we apply this? The start actually has to be with the kind of experience that you're bringing to the table, which is that if we understand from a very human point of view what we want to do and how we want to build these relationships, then we can begin to put the technology around that. So we have to start with humans, with relationships, with flourishing, and then think, how could technology support that human aspect? We can't, if we start with the technology, we design the wrong things. And then the final thing to say that is very difficult, and I don't think we have any of us answers for this. I mean, I'd be interested in Korea, how you're grappling with this, is that I think it's really important, and this goes to the scaling question, that in this revolution that we, the people, own the tools and that we can use them, we can take them apart, we can reuse them. So a health app that kind of is shared in our community that we can use to think about who needs what and how we can help each other is really different to a health app that's designed by Microsoft or Apple that sits in the cloud, that takes our data and then serves it back up to us, you know, telling us things that in fact alienate us from our own bodies and our own communities. So how we use the brilliance of the technology that is coming out of big tech, but keep control of the tools, is something that over the next couple of decades we're really going to have to grapple with. And I think talking about it, again, we don't have answers, but talking about it is really important.
That's very important. I have one more question. You talked about the barriers of change. For example, government doesn't want to experiment with taxpayers' money. Politicians don't want to be too bold and brave. NGOs can get jealous about radical attempts. And people cannot think outside of the box. How do you propose to deal with the resistance? And as the world faces new challenges during this pandemic, do you have additional things to say about radical health?
Yes, so of course we could take another hour talking about resistance and sharing our stories, because all of us who've been in this work, we know how it's like rolling the rock up the hill, and we know how hard it is. And I mean, I think the main thing I would say about resistance is that teamwork is really important, that you can only really make change in a team with really strong horizontal alliances. And often when I'm giving talks, young people come and they say, you know, I've read your book, and in fact even my boss has read your book, but she doesn't change her behavior. What should I do? And I say, you have to move. You have to get somewhere where you've got a good team and you've got a leader that understands this, because without this it's very difficult to make the change. I mean, a couple of things about the pandemic. We can talk a bit more about the resistance, but a couple of things about the pandemic that I think are really important is when, with my work before, if I would go to a local government, like a local administration, and I would show them the circle work, the older people's work, and I would say, you know, look how we've changed the social, look at sort of what is happening socially where we've started a circle. And I would also say, look how much money it saved the state systems, because people aren't going into hospitals, they're not going into care homes. And always the government leaders of the local administrations would say, well, the data is really fantastic, we really like this, but we can't do this here because nobody will join in. People just, you know, in this city, nobody participates in anything. And I would always say, well, give me a try. Like, I haven't failed yet. And if I tried, we could build. But I don't know how it's been in Korea. But one of the things that's happened here in the UK in the pandemic is that people have joined in. They've used apps in their streets, in their neighborhoods. Do you have this in Korea? And they've helped each other. They've carried meals for each other. They've given each other lifts, like informally. Everywhere people have begun to really help each other, and people have been really surprised, because we have this idea that British people, they don't join in, that they stay inside their houses, they never talk to their neighbors, you know, we're not like Latin American people, we're very insular people. But we've seen that that's not the case. So I think this is really, really important, because now, first of all, we've talked to our neighbours, so we can't ignore them in the future. And secondly, that we've seen that people will really join in. So I think that there's a kind of opening now to approaches that include more people. We've also actually seen, and I don't think this is not the case in Korea, where you've managed the pandemic, of course, much better than here in the UK. But here as well, we've also seen how very centralised systems have failed us very badly. So we have a health service that emotionally we love, but actually practically, managerially has failed. Like, they couldn't get PPE into the system. They couldn't, you know, the systems have been overwhelmed. And eventually, like with the vaccination program, which is going very well in the UK, that's because they gave it to local areas to manage, instead of asking these vertical kind of mass production systems to manage it. And suddenly it's working very well. So we've had a lesson in system failure, that the kind of old centralized systems can't work. And I think people have seen that. The other thing that's happened is that, and again, this is more acute, I'm sure, in Britain than in Korea, but the other thing is that we've seen that the pandemic has not affected everybody equally, that, you know, we've got many communities without broadband, they haven't been able to do their school lessons, people have gone hungry, you know, some people have been much more exposed to risk through the work that they do, and so on. And actually, one thing that was very, very important in the welfare state and coming after the war was that in the war, in all our nations, we worked side by side with each other. It didn't matter what class we came from, or whether we were an urban person or a rural person or young or old, we all collaborated. And what happened then was that people began to understand that this person who is poor, it's not because they're lazy, it's not because they didn't try, it's because our systems, our social systems and our economic systems are organized in a certain way that makes it impossible for some people to succeed. And again, in this pandemic, what we've seen that this is the case. Like, we've understood in Britain, or more people have understood, I would say, that first of all, we have really bad poverty. Like, you know, we really have poverty, like, terrible for a country with the economy that we have. And also that this is not because people are lazy, it's because the systems are working in certain ways. So I think there's an opening now. It's not that we won't face the resistance that you asked me in the question. There are still some people, quite powerful people, thinking in very old-fashioned ways, but we have seen some different stories. So those of us who are trying to make change now, we can find the allies in the system who've also seen those stories, and we can begin to run in different ways. Can I just say one final thing about resistance of government? I think one thing that was really important for those of you who are not just readers of the book, but also practitioners and trying to change welfare systems in practice, is that I always asked the government department who was responsible for the problem, whether it's aging or work, to give me some money and to give me some senior people on my team. Because often, even though they weren't open in the beginning to kind of thinking in an innovative way, it meant that once we'd created the solution, we weren't then trying to kind of take it to government and say, oh, look what we've made, would you like this? And they're always like, oh no, because we didn't invent that, so we don't want it. They had some sense of ownership that, yes, we were part of this team, this is important work. And then they began to talk with their colleagues in a different way about the work. And I think that was also really important. But of course, one of the things in radical help is that not everything worked. In fact, when I went to Norway with the translation, the mayor of Oslo introduced me and he said, we like Hilary because all she talks about is how much she failed, and then we can all learn from how much she failed. But I think that's also important, to be able to be in teams where we can share, because we're trying to make really big change. And I think none of us have the answers. We all, you know, I don't have the answers. We're going to create those answers working and making together. And I think that's what's important.
It's very interesting. I hope we can invite you someday and discuss more.
I would love that, yes.